Welcome back to Nature Labs and our live coverage of the 2025 Newfoundland and Labrador election. The polls have closed, the results are beginning to come in, we're getting closer to knowing who will form the next government in Newfoundland and govern that province moving forward at this critical juncture in our nation's history. But as the results come in, we're beginning to see a picture that being painted that I want to talk about, and of course, that is the issue of the urban-rural divide. This is a major issue. We've talked ad nauseum about it in class. I know we're going to talk more about it in our upcoming chapter in our Canadian sovereignty series, your inquiry media story that we're releasing throughout the course of this year. And in that story, as you'll soon see, we've interviewed people like conservative strategist Hamish Marshall, who's also a demographics expert, who argues the urban-rural divide is a bit overplayed, that there's no such thing as a monolithic block of pro-urban or pro-rural, pro-conservative or pro-liberal. There's a lot more nuance to it, broken down around suburban and ex-urban communities, and how that vote can fluctuate with time. All very true. Pete Smith with the Center for Rural Arts and Creativity, he talks about how the rural-urban divide isn't something physical. It's a construct of our mind. It's an idea we've imagined, that there's a divide between people who live in cities and people who live in more rural landscapes. But with apologies to both Hamish and Pete, who both have valid points to be made, the urban-rural divide is an increasing issue in our democracy because it is splitting how our political representatives come to our legislative bodies, whether that's provincially or federally. And of course, there is no monolithic block. If you look at rural ridings, you're going to see that there's going to be voters who back Liberal Party and the NDP and Greens in some cases. But what you do see is a concentration increasingly of conservative voters who are backing, or rather people who are backing conservative candidates in rural ridings. Conversely, in urban centers and cities particularly, but in the suburban ring to some extent around those big cities, we see how people, certainly in provincial elections, are more likely to back progressive parties, whether that's the Liberals, the NDP, or the Greens. That vote can be split up sometimes and allow conservatives to come up the middle, because there are certainly conservative voters in our big cities, whether we're talking Newfoundland, whether we're talking anywhere in this country. But there's no question that those who represent us, of course, it all comes down to who has the majority of votes in these key electoral ridings. So while there might not be 100% conservative in a rural riding or 100% liberal voter in an urban riding, that's certainly how it materializes in our legislative bodies, whether we're talking in Newfoundland and Labrador or at any level of government in this country. And we're beginning to see that in Newfoundland. And why is that interesting? Well, because Newfoundland has traditionally kind of bucked the urban-rural divide trend. We've seen larger blocks, the vote kind of be a bit more ebbing and flowing across the province. Again, probably because some of the big issues have been a bit more nuanced, like we talked about in the last video, about how it's not necessarily develop or don't develop resources, but rather about how do we conserve our resources by developing them to help create the money to protect them, or protect them so we create the conditions to allow them to be developed. Kind of two sides of the same coin. That's allowed the Newfoundland and Labrador electorate to be a little bit more nuanced, not so monolithic in any way, shape, or form, and have their House of Assembly be a little bit more broad-based in terms of having liberal support from rural communities and conservative support from urban areas. That's not maybe going to be the case in this electoral outcome. We're going to see a much harder conservative base of MHAs coming from rural constituencies, and probably more MHAs coming from, for the Liberals, coming from those urban centers, places like St. John's. So these are major issues in our democracy, because when you see that kind of schism in our legislative bodies, even if it's not necessarily monolithic in the real world, those representatives kind of display a hardened divide in our society around some of these big questions that we have to face as a nation. How do we protect our sovereignty? How do we grow our economy? How do we combat the cost of living crisis? How do we tackle crime? How do we protect the environment? How do we advance social justice issues like reconciliation? All these issues increasingly are being divided down that urban-rural divide, and certainly, as Hamish points out in that next story, it's not quite so present in the real world. There's a lot more nuance in terms of how each of us think about these issues in terms of where we live and what affects us. But in terms of who represents us in these legislative bodies, it is increasingly conservative for rural, liberal for urban, and that is a a fight, because politics, of course, is a fight for power, the fight to make choices. And when the questions are so stark and the choices are so different, and the people who are backing them divide from very different kind of landscape origins, that creates a real schism in terms of how our country can go forward. And of course, the question of the legitimacy of the way we run elections in this country around first past the post. Does it weigh more favor to rural communities? Does it give more power to urban areas? These are big questions that are being debated. We're talking about it in your class. We're going to talk about it in the inquiry meetings going forward. But all that stuff we've been discussing around the urban-rural divide, all those issues of why it's concerning to our democracy, all of why it's leading to division around big questions at a time we need unity, that's all playing out tonight in the Newfoundland and Labrador election. And if the final makeup of this House of Assembly comes down to Conservatives largely from rural, Liberals largely from urban areas, that's a concern in terms of the decisions and who feels like they're not having their voice heard in the decisions being made in Newfoundland and Labrador. And of course, it's just one more case of how this issue is playing out all across our country. It's a real issue for us all to tackle. We all have a responsibility. Even if we continue to back candidates from our respective regions that play into the stereotype, how do we overcome that stereotype and make sure urban and rural are working together for the betterment of all Canadians, and making sure that the solutions that we promote and ideas we put forth are truly ideas that are inclusive of ideas from both urban and rural communities, the culture, the values, the identity that come from those areas. Because only when we do that will we create a country that can safeguard our sovereignty.